we organize this webinar pretty much in 2 sections. So the first part, I want to present the new portal. We will be actually navigating through the UI, present the new functionalities, perhaps more towards the beginning of the second part. I'd like to show some comparisons between what we have now and how the new portal that we are launching is. And then I'd like to keep questions to the end of the call. So let me start and sharing my screen, and then we can start showing. So I am logged into the new portal. So that's a bit of the new interface already. So when we log in as a new merchant, when we log in, we come now to the new Optile home. So this homepage is very different from what we used to have back in the days, right? So now we have links, quick links actually to the most important functions on the portal. So these are normally the operations that you want to execute when you configure your payments functionality, okay? And they serve as, exactly as it implies, right? They serve as quick links to actually elements we have on the left menu. So the portal is organized still in a similar way as we had previously. So we have a left menu with access to the most, or to all applications actually we have in the portal, and the content you want to handle is going to be presented in the center. Okay. You see that also the left menu changed quite a bit. So we reorganized actually the links there in a more logical way. So on the very top, we have a link now to the merchant, right? So all merchants you have access to will appear here on top. And then we have different sections, right? So on top, we have access to the more important reporting and monitoring applications. And then we have applications connected to your payment setup, okay? So applications necessary to configure access to providers, route them, define how your payment page or checkout page is gonna look like, risk management, so with our risk rules, and automatic retry, so for our automated retry for decline transactions in recurring mode, so we configure them here. And towards the bottom, we have quick links to our support and also documentation. I can give also a sneak peek of the new documentation. We're working that as well. And everything related to general merchant settings is now under profile and team, right? So here's where you see, for example, stuff like the merchant profile, merchant name, addresses, the classic like basic information about the merchant, but also where I can change my password, where I can see my legal documents, where I can log out. So the more generic management came all the way down here, and the important applications have been reorganized in a more logical way. Switching merchants, back in the day, we used to have a link on the right side. So now we have this link on the left side. Switching is basically the same. So I pick my merchant, click on it. You can see the switching right now, it's much better than before. So the switch goes faster. This is basically because we migrated all applications, so all portal applications to React.js. So everything is actually built in a different way, and it's way more responsive because of that. So the classic underlines of this portal, so the APIs that we still that we had already to provide data to the portal, for example, databases of providers, the connection between providers and routings, this hasn't changed, but the front-end technologies are all based on React now, okay? So this, you will notice that the portal behaves a bit better. So it's snappier, generally switching merchants and also opening applications feels a bit faster because of that. But still, the APIs behind the scenes are the same, so we haven't touched that. This is a project that's still gonna come in the future. So we expect that once we do that, we could have actually even better performance. So for now, it's mostly because of the front-end changes. So we used to have a platform where our report and also documentation were hosted, and this platform has been substituted in place of React applications. They're a bit better right now. Okay, So we have our typical quick switch here, quick access menu, right? I could either start using the portal by clicking on the links here, or I can, of course, navigate on the left side and switch applications there as well. So it really depends what you prefer. The idea of having this is for a completely new user to have a quick look on what kind of applications we have and how they can start using the portal. Okay, so we're also designing a bit with usability in mind right now. So that's why we provide such links here. Configuration in general is very similar. So the idea of this portal stays the same. So we want to give access to merchants so that they configure their payment setup in our system. Normally, the very first step of configuring is by adding our provider contracts. Okay, so this will be then the PSP, right? The PSP credentials that you need to configure in our platform so that our system can execute, can send payment transactions to them on your behalf. So once I click on that, we have an overview of the currently configured payment service providers. Okay, so this is the list of providers I have configured in my own demo merchant here. And if I want to add a new provider, I click on add contract on the right side. That contract wizard now is a bit better. We have redesigned it pretty much entirely. Okay, so it follows a more logical sequence of steps. And as you can see, right, we show also the logos for all providers we have a connection to. So it's a bit easier to, of course, pick the provider you wanna create a contract with. I can either click on it. For example, let's say I wanna create an ADN contract. I can click on it, and then I can select different adapters in our platform. They are integrating ADN in this case, but I can also search for it, right? So let's say the same case, ADN, where we would be filtering then based on the characters you put in the search box here. Okay, so for example, word, so everything that contains word line and word pay results. Okay, let's just create a quick contract here with Hubtile Test PSP. So that's our own testing, our dummy PSP really for testing. Its functionalities stay the same. So the idea is still to provide you with a dummy PSP, but although it doesn't process real transactions, it's still able to simulate the behavior of our platform on Sandbox. Okay, so you pick a provider, you pick an adapter, you hit continue. Okay, and you notice on the left side that makes you navigate through then the several steps we have here when configuring. Those steps are mostly the same. We just redesigned pretty much this flow so that it's easier to understand and it's more logical overall. Okay, so in the first steps, we picked then a combination of methods and countries that will be used by this provider. Okay, so where this provider is going to be working and for which payment methods. I can select them on a global scale as I have here. For example, let's say I say Amex and MasterCard, but I can also specify countries in a similar way as I had before. Okay, and here, once I click on it, I see a search box. Okay, I could pick a provider directly, or I can search for it. So let's say I put Germany, I find then Germany is a country. And then in the same way, I could then select the boxes representing the payment methods for Germany. Okay, so this works in a similar way as we had before. If I leave global, it means that my provider would be initially available in any country. If I select it for a specific country, it means that that combination of methods and country is going to be later than appearing in my routing table. Okay, so it means that that provider specifically, in this case, will be serving Discover and Master in Germany, and American Express and MasterCard for any other country. So this remains unchanged. I hit continue to go to the next tab. So here, normally we give the API parameters. This table is a table that contains different parameters depending on the provider that you're using. Okay, so it maps the parameters necessary to configure that specific provider access, so access to that provider's API. In the case of test PSP, is very minimalistic. We actually, as a mandatory parameter, we really just need the gateway URL. Depending on the provider, we will have here then different parameters. Okay. We continue. The next, we pick divisions and currencies. Okay. In my case, I'll be assigning it to my default division, and I will be leaving it to process any currency passed in our API. Divisions, right? So the idea of division is that within our platform, you can have only one default division, meaning that every provider and every routing configuration goes to your default division. So it's a single configuration for that specific merchant. In my case, my own demo merchant here. But you can also create several divisions, meaning that you could have different divisions with different payment methods and different routing configurations. So for example, if in your business, you have different use cases, or you have different shops, or different business strategies, different perhaps PSP contracts, you could create divisions that map such use cases. So for example, I could be a car manufacturer with a division for car parts, a division for recharging, a division for parking, a division for secondhand cars. And depending on the division, I could have different PSPs that perhaps match better the use case of that specific division. Okay, so for a more risky use case, perhaps I have PSPs that handle better fraud and would have perhaps a different acceptance rate in comparison to a division that's perhaps used on a broader range, right, by different users. So the idea of divisions is to map such use cases. So in this step, I pick the divisions to which I want to associate my PSP. In my case here, let's leave it just on the default division. Once I go next, I see the mapping of costs and transaction limits. So this here would be an indication of how much the provider costs to the merchant whenever I send a transaction through this adapter here. Okay, so the costs we changed it a little bit. So now we have the option to select fixed cost and deságio, so a percentage at the same time. And of course, as before, I could also specify it per combination of method and country. Okay, so I could also select a list of possible methods and countries as I defined initially in my contract, and make those costs specific for those combinations. Okay. The idea of this costs input is to later in routing give us an idea of how much the provider costs you to be used. Okay, so if you have several providers working on the same country with the same payment methods, we have one routing strategy that helps you picking the cheapest of them first, always. Okay, so if you send a transaction to us, for example, in this case, a Discover payment in Germany, and if you have more than one provider that can process that, we will be picking, for example, the cheaper of them based on the costs information you give us here. Okay. So for example, you would probably put something like this. Okay, so next step. So in the next step, we configure then the last additional settings. This is also similar to what we had before. So it's where we could potentially disable 3D Secure in regions that still allow you to do that, but also enable several registrations, so credit cards, payment method registration options. Okay, so recurring payments or simultaneous account registrations, in case you have several providers for the same method. So we have different features here covering that as well, and this has not changed from what we had before. You notice as well on top, right? So right now, if I click on finish, I'll be finishing this configuration. I don't have to, because I have already test PSP configured for my merchant, and we can also easily cancel and go back. Okay, so I'll be following this option instead. So once we finish configuring that, we would be able to see all providers we have, as I have here on screen. Okay, so we have several, in my case, I have several providers. These are not all providers that we actually have a connection with. These are only the providers that we have, that I have actually in my demo merchant. And once I'm done with those configurations, then the next normal step would be actually to go to routing. Okay, so the idea of routing now is, assuming I have several providers possibly competing in the same region and processing the same payment methods, how can I now decide which provider is going to be taken first? Okay, so for example, if I have, let's say, MasterCard, okay, in Germany, I have several payment. So if I need to click a bit on the left. So if I have several providers, I can now pick which providers will be used and in which order. So those are the routing strategies as we had before. And those strategies actually haven't changed yet. So we have still the same strategies available in the portal. Before we go there, I'm going to show you a bit of how the UI has changed as well. So you see that the main concept still is the same. So we have still all countries on top and all payment methods on left. Those countries and those payment methods, they actually come from the provider contracts we configured before, okay? So in several different provider contracts, I defined that perhaps in provider number 1, I have it to be available only in Austria. Provider 2 is available in Brazil. Provider 3 in Canada, provider 4 in Germany and Spain, and so on. So all those country combinations appear here on top. And in a similar way, payment methods on the left side. Okay, so one provider covers, for example, MasterCard and Visa, another one PayPal, and so on. So all possible payment methods still appear here on the left side. A big change is that this table now is, the first row is fixed, so the header row is fixed. This made it much easier to navigate. So before, probably some of you still remember that it used to be a bit hard actually to see. For example, if I scroll down, I would not be able to see which country I was at anymore. So they used to be a bit confusing actually in the configuration. So now I always see the countries on top. And also selecting a specific route is a bit more logical right now. Okay, so I simply click on the side, right? So on the region that defines it, and then I see the routing options popping up in a separate modal window. We still have the same routing options. Their names changed a little bit, but their functionality is actually still the same. So the first of them is called fixed order. Okay, so this is very similar to what we had before. And it means that the payment providers that I select will be possible fallback options, and they will be triggered in the order that we have defined here. Okay, so in my example, MasterCard in Germany, if a user tries to pay with a MasterCard in a German shop, we will be trying automatically first with ADN, and then falling back to checkout, and then falling back to the merchant pay case. A decline or a so-called soft decline normally happens. I can, before also moving the order of these providers was a bit cumbersome, a bit clunky. So right now it's much easier, right? So I just click on the left side and drag and drop them, okay? So that makes it much easier actually to change your order. Disabling them is also quite easy, right? So I just trigger the button on the right side, and that enables or disables them. Okay, so that was the first routing option. The second one is called fixed share. Fixed share is what we used to call active-active. Okay, so in fixed share, I give my providers a percentage, and that percentage is divided across 100%, meaning that the percentage that provider receives is the volume of transaction that's going to be routed to that provider. So for example, in my case here, I have 50% of my transactions being sent to ADN and the other 50% to checkout.com. And in a similar way as we had before, I can, of course, raise or decrease the value of those volumes, and they will be automatically adjusted to the other provider. Okay, so in my case here, for example, I could have a 60-40 division, or an 80-20, 90-10, and so on. In fact, anything between 0 and 100 is possible here as a share for a provider. And I can have as many as I want, right? So, and the use cases here can be many, right? I could have a 2-provider setup or a 3-provider setup, a 4-provider setup. It really depends how many I have and how I want to send my transaction volumes to them. And use cases vary. You could, for example, do A/B testing. That's normally a case that our merchants ask for. So you could, for example, set them, let's say we have a dual provider setup, I could set them to 50-50 and track their performance over a period of time. So technically, we will be sending them 50% of the transactions each. But if after a period of time, after evaluation of those provider performances, I discover that one of them performs better, let's say one of them has better acceptance rates, I could immediately conclude that that provider is a better option for me. So I could, for example, disable the second one, or I could increase the share sent to the better provider. So that's one of the use cases. There could be many. It depends really on how you want to use this feature. Again, we renamed it. We changed a bit how the UI behaves, but the feature in itself is something that was already available in the previous portal. The third routing strategy is called least cost. Okay, so this here is the one that goes by the fees as we had defined previously on the previous screen. Okay, so we select the providers that we want to have active, and our system will automatically pick the first of them based on the routing cost as defined in that provider contract. As soon as I hit save, this is also the same. So as soon as I hit save, I will be storing that configuration. Okay, I could still work on more settings. And if I want to make that configuration live, I have to click on save on the top level. Okay, so I can, the idea is that you can work on several routing configurations at once. Once you're done, you can save on top, and that pretty much, let's say, stores it for your live setup. And as before, this also has not changed. Any settings that you change here, as soon as you hit save, they'll be reflected in your payment page as well. Okay, so if you use, for example, our hosted payment page or our selective native with our library payment page, the payment methods that are available per country, they'll be reflecting automatically the settings that you have here defined in the portal. Okay, some other details that I didn't talk about before. So now we have also some quick filters here on top. Okay, so I can filter the view that I have below by selecting the payment methods on the list. So for example, if I want to show only MasterCard, I click on it, and then it displays only the row for MasterCard. The same for countries, and the same for the configurations. Configuration is a bit different. Let me just show you what it means. You see that when I do not have any filter, you see that some rows are grayed out, right? So they do not have any active rule for them. So in the configurations, I can filter those rows. I can filter out rows that are not active and vice versa. So for example, if I want to show relevant rows, okay, so only rows that have some available route, some configured routes, I can filter that out as well. My table here is pretty big, so it might take a couple seconds until the system processes that and filters out, but as you can see, it's already done. Okay, so routing, in general, the concept of routing is still the same. Okay, so it is really to configure how the payment methods will be routed through different countries based on the payment service providers that we have configured in our backend. So this feature is also, all features you're going to see across this presentation, that all features are unchanged. We pretty much really only updated the user interface here, so with usability and flexibility in mind. So once we're done with routing, with provider contracts and routing, we are technically actually ready to start integrating our payment page and start testing. But I can advance and show you some of the other features, just show you the UI, how it looks like, so that another next possible step is checkout configuration. In checkout configuration, as we had before, we can then define how the payment page is going to look like and which payment methods in which order are going to be displayed. And we can also display, so if I click on the edit option here, I can also see how exactly the payment method is going to behave. This is very similar to what we had before. So for example, for Visa, I can pick display probability and do some hiding options. This is exactly as we had before. And I can also define how my payment methods will be stored and how I want to display the options to store payment methods in our payment page. So back in the day, we used to call this checkboxes, and we had different options for how the checkboxes are displayed. So this has been simplified and made in a more logical way right now. So we have different options as we had before, but they map better to what a user would expect. So if I select those options, it also changes how my payment page display those checkboxes then for registration for user credit card or user payment method registration. And I can, as we had before, I can also drag and drop payment methods to decide in which order they're going to be displayed in the payment page. So this is also something that we made a bit better. So we simplified the UI a little bit in comparison to what we used to have. Next step is risk management. This application is an application that we had before, and we revamped here as well. So it's our simplified risk management, where we can create rules that define how a transaction is going to be blocked. And we have basically two types of rules for blocking transactions. One of them is based on values, and the second one is based on thresholds, so velocity checks. Okay, so classic example of values would be, for example, let's block users if they come from a specific IP address, or if they have a specific username, or even better, we could give the system a list of such values initially. So for example, I have in my case here a list of email addresses that I want to block and a list of account hashes I want to block. And when I create a rule, I link that rule to an existing list. The rules and the main concept to how those rules has not been changed either. And again, this here was mostly a UI, mostly a cosmetic change. I don't want to explore too much in detail the functionality here because it really it hasn't really been changed from what we had before. If you have any questions, we can explore that towards the end of the call. Okay. And then the last configurable here is our automatic retry system. We used to call this automated denial management. And in this tool here, we have basically a mechanism to retry transactions in case of recurring payments. And it's based on our mapping of interaction codes and reasons. So our global mapping of such codes. So basically in our platform, when you send a payment transaction through our API, our backend adapters, so the elements that actually connect to the real PSPs and their APIs, those adapters receive a response code from the PSPs, and those response codes are mapped to our own representation of interaction codes and reasons. And using this representation, we provide this tool that enables a way of retrying transactions case a transaction is mapped to one of those combinations of interaction code and reason. So this is a feature that we had before. We haven't touched it. And it works exactly in the same way as we had before, right? So basically, we have several combinations of interaction code and reasons. And if a transaction, a recurring transaction is declined and is mapped to one of them, we can define the period, so when we want to retry that transaction, so exactly the same transaction. So we can basically wait for a couple of days, or a couple of hours, a couple of minutes, or wait until a specific day of the month. If I click on, for example, the edit icon, I can see this in a bit more detail here. Okay, so I can customize exactly the amount of days and hours, or customize a specific day of the month. All right. This is in terms of retry. Another second feature connected to the same system is what we call the just expiry date and retry. So the idea of this feature is, if you have a registered credit card in our system and you try to send a recurring transaction on it, it can be that that card is already expired. And if you don't have anything to deal with it, you would lose the transaction because the PSP would probably decline it. So with this tool here, we could think of a logic. We could set a logic that in case that transaction is declined because the credit card is expired, we could define a way of guessing a new expiry date. So normally when a credit card is expired, only the year is actually changed. So your bank is going to send you a new card, same card number. And then the expiry date, the new expiry date is going to have only the year changed. So with this tool here, we could give it as a quick logic for retrying then a new possible credit card, try to guess the new expiry date. So in my case here, for example, I have, in case the transaction fails, we try again, adding 3 years. And then if it fails, we add 4 years. If it fails again, we add 5 years. Okay, if I want to create a new rule from here, I can pass a specific list of IENs. Okay, so Ben's IENs to trigger the rule with, and then a different year range here to do that replacement. So this would be, let's say, the block of configurations, so payment configurations. On the top side, let's go back then a couple steps. So on the top, we have then the most important applications for monitoring and reporting transactions. So those applications have also been migrated to the new platform, with the exception of the technical monitor. So the technical monitor is still running in our previous system. This is a tool that we rely on and is used mostly by a very small amount of people, normally our support team and also developers. So for this reason, we haven't touched it yet. But the other applications, you'll see that they have been also modernized using the same user interface and the same color and design schemes as the rest of the portal. So we have the dashboard. This used to be the KPI dashboard, and this application is where you define KPIs that you want to track for your merchant performance. Okay, so for your transaction processing performance, and those KPIs are based on a list of predefined KPIs. You can click on Add KPI and you're going to see them here. You can pick a KPI from this drop-down list. So for example, I want to see all open charges. I will select then an interval which I want to display those transactions. So for example, I want to track all open charges that happened, let's say the last month. And I can add some additional filters. So for example, I could only show the charges that were sent for euros or for US dollars or for a specific provider, let's say only with PayPal and so on. Once I add then the items, you're going to see then that it appears as a new element, so as a new card in the user interface, and the functionality here is very similar to before. Okay, so you see the KPI as we have, and you could click on the 3 dots then to, for example, expand it and see a bit more details, see a quick chart of how that option has been defined over the period of time that we pre-selected before. By clicking on delete, I can remove it, obviously, and click on edit. I'm able then to change, for example, that KPI. So perhaps I didn't like, I don't want to use for last month. I actually want to change it to last quarter. So that's how you edit it. Then we have the transactions. They used to be called My Transactions. Functionality here, very similar. So the idea is to track all transactions that went through our platform. We give it quick overview initially. On top, we still have the options to filter the transactions. So I can filter, for example, by periods of time, specifically either by let's say the predefined dates here, or calendric. So I could also define a specific day or specific timestamps. But I can also filter by different elements, for example, operation, so per API operation or system, or per specific payment methods, specific providers, or countries. If I'm using this tool from a, let's say, management perspective, or if I'm a developer or an accountant that wants to search for a specific transaction, I can search for the transaction details using then the advanced search block. So for example, if I have the transaction ID, or if I know that that transaction is a transaction that failed with a, let's say it was declined, for example, it was a debit canceled, I could also add some additional search details here to pre-filter that transaction. And then the transactions that we display on the block on the bottom side, they reflect then those filters defined on top. If I click on a transaction, I can see details of it. So I can see, for example, which provider has been used for it, and I can also see specific details, for example, if it failed or not, or in which stage it is currently. So any transaction details or any routing options that we took. So for example, in this case here, the route we picked was for checkout.com, they will be displayed here. And as before, I can also show advanced details, so advanced communication details as registered by our backend. So these will be normally data that you send to us using our API. And this data is available here. You can display it and you can download here as well. So back to the main menu, I could also export the current view of transactions. So for example, I can filter based on some criteria on top. I can pick which columns I want to display, okay? And if I click on export, I'll be generating this list of transactions in a CSV file. So for example, if I have users that want to work on it separately on Excel, perhaps want to run an additional analysis, they could also do that by exporting those transactions from here. Another transaction that we updated, another application that we updated is what we used to call My Customers. Now it's just Customers. It is focused, before we had on transactions, a focus on transaction level data. So on a high level, what transactions have been sent to our system. And on customers, we have a focus on which customers are interacting with us and which transactions have been sent or have been processed in behalf of those customers. So for example, if your team has a call center unit and they want to resolve a specific issue with a customer, perhaps the customer call in and want to check why the transaction is not going through or why his credit card is not getting accepted. You could have this person use this tool here, for example, to search for the customer name or search for the customer ID and resolve specific issues for that customer. So for example, I type John here and we found 2 users that have something related to John, right? So both of them, for example, they use the same email. The email contains John. So if I click on the specific username, I will see then all transactions that have been processed for that person. And then I could easily then, it's very similar to the transactions application. If I click on a specific row, I could see details of that specific transaction. And so at which point it has stopped or which customer data has been passed to us and so on. And then the last tool is a technical monitor. This tool hasn't changed yet, so we have a link to it here, but if you click, let me open it actually in another tab. If you load it, you will see that it's still running on our old interface. So this is a tool that we haven't touched yet. So in terms of portal, that's mostly it. So our main goal really was to modernize it, align it to the Payoneer branding, meaning that we have the Payoneer colors, the Payoneer design guidelines. So we use the same colors, same fonts, same general structure as well for how we organize applications. But while doing that, we also modernized the front end infrastructure. Okay, so these applications are now running on React.js. This means that we can deploy them much faster now. We can give updates in a more streamlined and a more easier way. And in general, those applications, they also benefit from slightly better performance. So I hope you noticed that as well during the call. So switching across merchants or switching across applications is generally faster now because of the switch. So that's mostly it from my side. We can open it now for Q&A. And feel free to either post here on the chat or raise your hands, or we can also mute you and can also speak up. Okay, so thanks a lot for your patience. Okay, so got a first one here. Do we still need to switch in the same way between live and sandbox environment? Yeah, so for now, this portal, so everything I showed here to you is available only on Sandbox. Okay, so for now we are testing on Sandbox. All of you still already have access to it, and you're free actually to give us any feedback to whether you like it or not, or if it's behaving as you expected. But in the future, we will be, let me share my screen again. So in the future, our idea is to have this portal, to have a link here on top to enable you a quick switch between Sandbox and Live. So before we had a completely different link, so you would switch actually to Live by changing, for example, here, instead of Sandbox, you type Live. In the future, we want to have a quick switch on top here to make that a bit more seamless. We're also testing different design options. One thing I didn't show before is that, let me move this pop-up here from my screen. So on top, you see a pop-up here that shows you some quick information about the application you are at, okay? After you're done with it, if you click on Got It, that pop-up is gonna disappear. And in the future, when you switch between Live and Sandbox, we are testing a way also of popping up a message here to make it clear that you are on either of those environments. So this is something we're testing right now, but we definitely want to make a switch, let's say, make it easier for you to switch between Live and Sandbox. I think we have more. Yeah, there's different chats. So there's a chat and there's a Q&A. So just go ahead and post whatever you feel like it makes more sense. But let me read them separately here. So I see something in the chat. So is it possible to search with the last 4 signs of a credit card? Okay, I think this is in regards to the transactions application. So as of now, I believe this is not possible yet. Something we could consider though. Normally it is allowed actually to expose those details. So we could also take that back home and see if it can be reworked. So as of now, I believe it's not possible actually. So the other question is, are there updates planned for KPIs in the new portal? Calendar time period for successful invoice charges, for example. Yeah, so the KPI application is being, actually the entire, not only the front-end application, but the entire back-end service is being heavily reworked. So we have a completely new team working on that right now. And we are exploring actually different analytics options there. Okay, so right now we know that this application still lacks quite a lot of features. And even in terms of analytics, we know that we could offer more options there for customers, for example, that want to have a more, let's say, more intelligent information about their own performance, or they want perhaps to A/B test PSPs in a better way. So this is something that we are addressing already since the end of last year, in fact. And in the same way, we want to rework that dashboard as well to not only offer more KPIs, but also offer better information there and better ways of displaying that information. So I'm not sure if I can answer whether you're working on a specific calendar time period for now, but it's something that if we are not working, can definitely also take to our developers and check if this is being addressed. But as a message, I want to tell you that this specific application is expected to be improved actually quite heavily in the next year. So, and by the way, feel free if my answer is not exactly complete, if there's still something missing, feel free to post again or yeah, come back here in the chat or in the Q&A. So let me switch now to the Q&A. I see some questions coming there. Okay, how are the velocity checks set up? Perhaps I can share my screen again and then show you how that works. So let me switch the risk management. And then I share. Okay, so I'm sharing. Right, so when I'm in risk management and I create a new rule, I'm giving these two options. So velocity checks are actually set here, the threshold-based conditions. Then I pick initially which variable we are checking. So for example, let's say IP address. Okay, and then after we pick that, we see, let's say, pretty much a suggestion to how we wanna define the velocity check. So for example, IP address has more than, let's put 10 values for the same, let's say, email address in the last, let's put 5 minutes. Okay, so this, for example, would be a velocity check. So we would be blocking a transaction after more than 10. So let's say more than 10 IP addresses for the same email address. So just to make it clear, in our API, when you start a payment session with us, one possible field is the email address. We also collect the IP address of the customer. So if there are more than 10 transactions for the same email address, but coming from different IP addresses, and those 10 transactions happen in a span of 5 minutes, we'll start blocking them. Okay, so that's how it works. So those will be then velocity checks. And we can start by different variables then, right? So I use, for example, IP address as an example, but we could use, for example, I don't know, let's say the payment account number, right? So this will be pretty much the credit card. So if that account number has more than, let's say, 5 trials for the same customer number in the past, let's say 1 minute, we'll start blocking it. Okay, so a lot of trials in that credit card. So those would be examples of velocity checks. Okay. And the risk rules here, right, they work in conjunction with our routing. Okay, so before the transaction is being sent to a possible route, we actually evaluate if it applies to any of the rules we define in the portal. So if it falls into a rule, we will be then defining the transaction properly. If it doesn't, then we choose the available route to it. Okay. Any other question? I believe I am done here, unless I'm not seeing. Let me switch to the chat. Yeah, I don't see any new questions coming in. So we can give another minute or two. If not, we could finish the call earlier, save you some time. And by the way, this call is also being recorded. Okay, so we want to provide as well this recording to you later if you want to share it with more colleagues, or yeah, if some people could not attend the call, or if you want to perhaps double check how those features work compared to how you see in your own through your own user, use it as you want later. Okay. So I believe we don't have any more questions. So I propose we can finish the call now. We can save you some good 30 minutes here. This does not mean it is the end. So if you have questions, right? So if you have any problems, if you're already testing with the new portal, you can always reach out to us. You can come back directly to us per email. You can come directly to me, to Maria, to any of, for example, the project managers assigned to you. Or you can also send questions in our support channel. Okay, so support on Zendesk, as you already know. So anytime you have a question, you have any problem, you want to perhaps learn a bit more, or if you want to schedule a call with us, perhaps you want to expand on the providers you are working with, or you want to perhaps change your integration, or perhaps adapt to how the new portal looks like, you can also schedule a call and we do something personal to you. One last detail I didn't mention, this portal here is going to be working in parallel with the old version. Okay, so we are not switching off the old portal as we have right now. Okay, so we want to have this period now between now and beginning of next year as pretty much a testing period where both portals are working in parallel. And once we're done with that, we're planning to actually make this portal I showed here the main version, and this should happen in the beginning of next year. Okay. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming by and listening, for your patience as well. And we stay in touch. So thank you and goodbye. Have a nice rest of the day.